My name is Erin Castillo. I'm 34 years old. I've been a nurse for 10 years. For most of that decade, my father introduced me at family gatherings as the one who's still figuring things out, and my mother once told a room full of relatives that my nursing degree was basically a very expensive way of avoiding a real career. 2 weeks ago, at 2 a.m., my phone rang. It was my mother's number. She wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling from a hospital waiting room, her voice shaking, because my father had collapsed at home an hour earlier, and none of them understood a single word the doctors were telling them. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever had your work dismissed by the people who later needed it most, comment "I know that feeling" below. This one's for you. I decided to become a nurse at 19, after a summer spent volunteering at a hospice while I was still technically undeclared in college, uncertain what direction my life was supposed to take. Something about that work, the specific, unglamorous, essential presence of showing up for people at their most vulnerable, clarified something in me that no other class or career fair conversation ever had. I want to be honest that this wasn't the decision my family expected, or particularly wanted, from me. My father is an accountant, meticulous and practical in a way that shaped how he understood success, a clear career ladder, recognizable titles, predictable advancement. My mother, who'd given up her own early ambitions as a young woman to raise my brother David and me, seemed to have transferred a specific, complicated hope onto both of us, that we'd achieve something more externally impressive than the life she'd built. When I told them, at 19, that I was switching my major to nursing, my father's first question was about salary trajectories, compared unfavorably, in his mind, to the finance track I'd been vaguely considering before. My mother's first reaction was quieter, but no less pointed. "Nursing's a respectable job, I suppose, but I always pictured you doing something more." I didn't fully understand, at 19, how much that phrase, "something more," would end up defining the next 15 years of my relationship with both of them. I want to describe, honestly, the specific texture of how this dismissal showed up over the following decade, because I think the accumulation matters more than any single comment. At family dinners, my brother David's career in software sales generated genuine, sustained interest, questions about his clients, his commissions, his trajectory toward management. My updates about nursing school, and later my actual nursing career, tended to receive a polite nod before the conversation moved elsewhere, as though my work existed in some category adjacent to real careers rather than fully within it. My father, at a cousin's wedding when I was 26, 3 years into my career, introduced me to a table of extended family as the one who's still figuring things out, a description that landed with a specific, quiet sting, given that I was, by that point, working full-time in a busy emergency department, holding certifications my father had never bothered to ask about. My mother's comment about my degree being basically a very expensive way of avoiding a real career came at a different family gathering, my 30th birthday, delivered to my aunt within my hearing, framed as a light-hearted joke rather than the genuine assessment I understood it to be, given the pattern of comments that had preceded it. I remember one particular Thanksgiving, when I was 28, where the topic of careers came up around the table and my father spent nearly 15 minutes discussing David's recent promotion in detail, the specific title change, the new territory he'd be managing, projected commission increases for the coming year. When the conversation eventually turned to me, my father asked a single question, "Still at the same hospital?" and moved on to dessert before I'd even finished answering. I didn't say anything in the moment, the way I rarely said anything in the moment throughout those years. But I remember sitting at that table, watching my father's genuine enthusiasm for David's sales figures, and feeling a specific, familiar ache settle into my chest, not surprise, exactly, since the pattern was well established by then, but a fresh, renewed version of the same old hurt, arriving right on schedule the way it always did at these gatherings. I want to be honest about how I responded to this pattern over the years, because I think the specific shape of my own coping matters to understanding what finally changed. For a long time, I simply absorbed it, telling myself that my parents' generation understood career success differently, that their comments reflected a limited framework rather than genuine disrespect for what I actually did. I stopped bringing up specific details of my work at family gatherings, not out of shame, but out of a kind of protective exhaustion, why offer information that would only be met with polite disinterest or, worse, another version of the something more refrain? David, my brother, occasionally noticed the pattern and would sometimes, gently, try to redirect conversation toward my work at family events, a kindness I appreciated even as it never fully corrected the underlying dynamic. Erin actually just got certified in trauma nursing, he'd offer, unprompted, at a Christmas dinner, and my parents would nod, ask one polite follow-up question, and then pivot, within minutes, back to whatever update David himself had about his own career. I built a genuinely full, meaningful professional life during those years, entirely separate from my parents' understanding of it, moving from general medical surgical nursing into emergency medicine, eventually specializing further into trauma care, taking on charge nurse responsibilities, mentoring newer nurses through their own difficult early years in the field. None of it registered, in any meaningful way, with my parents' assessment of what I did for a living. I want to describe one specific night from my career, 3 years before my father's collapse, because I think it illustrates exactly the kind of expertise my family had spent years failing to notice. I was working a particularly brutal overnight shift when a car accident brought in a family of 4, the youngest a 6-year-old girl in critical condition. I was the trauma nurse assigned to her, working alongside the attending physician through nearly 4 hours of interventions, coordinating with surgery, managing her family's terror in the waiting room between updates, staying 2 hours past my scheduled shift end because I refused to hand off her care to someone who hadn't been there for the whole arc of it. She survived, in no small part, according to the attending physician who later specifically credited my quick recognition of a complication during her care, because of decisions made in the first critical hour. I drove home that morning, shaking with the specific, delayed adrenaline crash that comes after a shift like that, and told no one in my family about it. Not because I was hiding it, exactly, but because I'd learned, over years of similar unshared stories, that the telling would be met with polite distance rather than the kind of recognition the moment actually deserved. I think about that 6-year-old sometimes, now grown into a teenager, a life that continued because of expertise my own family had spent years quietly dismissing as somehow less than what they wanted for me. I never told my parents that story. I'm not sure, even now, that I ever will. 2 weeks ago, on an ordinary Tuesday night, I was off shift, asleep, when my phone rang at just after 2 a.m., my mother's contact photo lighting up my screen in the dark. I answered immediately, the specific, practiced alertness of someone who's spent a decade being woken by emergencies, professional and personal alike. "Erin," my mother said, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from her before, "your father collapsed. We're at the hospital." Nobody's explaining anything to me, and I don't understand what they're saying. I sat up immediately, my own heart rate climbing despite my professional training to stay calm in exactly these moments. "Which hospital?" I asked, already reaching for clothes. "St. Mary's," she said. "David's on his way too." "Erin, please, I don't understand any of what they're telling us." I drove to the hospital in under 20 minutes, arriving to find my mother and David in the emergency department waiting room, both of them visibly shaken, my mother's hands trembling around a paper cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched. I found the charge nurse on duty, someone I recognized from professional circuits, and asked her directly, using the specific vocabulary of my profession, for an update on my father's status. She recognized me immediately, gave me a quick, professional rundown. My father had suffered what appeared to be a cardiac event, currently stable but being monitored closely, cardiology consulted, further tests pending. I turned back to my mother and David, translating what I'd just heard into language that would actually mean something to them, without the clinical distance that had clearly left them frightened and confused when the treating physician had explained things earlier. "He's stable right now," I told them. "It looks like his heart had some kind of event. They're still figuring out exactly what kind, whether it's a blockage or something else. They've got him on monitors, and cardiology's going to come look at him soon. This is a serious situation, but he's in the right place, and they're taking it seriously." My mother's face, hearing this in plain, understandable language for what I suspected was the first time that night, crumpled with a specific relief I hadn't anticipated seeing directed at me. About 20 minutes after I arrived, the emergency physician who'd been treating my father, a man I didn't know personally, came out to give the family a fuller update. I watched him deliver the same information he'd apparently already given my mother and David once before, dense with clinical terminology, delivered efficiently but without much translation for a frightened family who had no medical background to draw on. I watched my mother's face as he spoke, the same lost, overwhelmed expression she must have worn the first time he'd explained things, before I arrived. When he finished and stepped away, I gently caught his attention. "I'm a trauma nurse," I told him, "and his daughter. Would you mind if I helped translate some of this for my mother and brother? I want to make sure they're not just nodding along without actually understanding what's happening." He looked at me with a flicker of professional recognition, the specific look one clinician gives another once credentials are established. "Of course," he said. "Actually, if you're comfortable, it might help if you sit in on updates going forward. Having someone who actually understands the terminology present usually reduces a lot of unnecessary fear for families." That small, professional acknowledgement, a doctor treating me as a peer capable of holding real information, rather than simply a frightened family member, landed with a specific, quiet significance I hadn't expected to feel that night, layered uncomfortably against the fear I still carried for my father's condition. Over the following hours, I stayed at the hospital, moving fluidly between two roles that had never before existed simultaneously in my family's understanding of me, daughter and nurse, both at once, in a way that made my professional competence suddenly, undeniably visible to the two people who'd spent a decade minimizing it. When the cardiologist came to explain the plan for a cardiac catheterization, using language dense with terms my mother and David clearly struggled to follow, I found myself instinctively translating in real time, asking the specific follow-up questions a layperson wouldn't know to ask, understanding immediately the difference between explanations that sounded reassuring and ones that actually were. My mother, at one point, grabbed my hand tightly during a particularly tense stretch of waiting, and said, quietly, "I didn't know you understood all of this so completely." "I don't think I ever really understood what you actually do." I didn't respond immediately, focused instead on watching the monitors, on staying present for what was, first and foremost, a genuine medical emergency involving my own father rather than an occasion for settling old scores. But I noted the comment, and the specific shift in her voice as she made it, understanding, even in that moment, that something significant was happening beyond just my father's cardiac event. On the second night of my father's hospital stay, while he was recovering in the cardiac care unit, I noticed something during a routine visit that I want to describe in detail, because it became, later, one of the moments my mother returned to repeatedly when explaining why the week had changed her thinking so completely. I was reviewing my father's medication list, a habit I'd developed professionally that I applied automatically, almost without thinking, to any hospitalized family member. I noticed a timing discrepancy, a blood thinner scheduled to be administered at an interval that, combined with a second medication he was also receiving, created a specific, if modest, risk of complication that the overnight nursing team, working a busy unit with many patients, hadn't yet flagged. I brought it to the attention of the charge nurse on duty, professionally, nurse to nurse, explaining exactly what I'd noticed and why it concerned me. She checked it immediately, confirmed the discrepancy, and adjusted the timing before it became an actual problem, a catch that, while not dramatic or life-threatening in the way a true emergency might have been, represented exactly the kind of vigilant, detail-oriented expertise that defines good nursing care. My mother, who happened to be in the room during this exchange, watched the entire interaction with a specific, quiet astonishment. "You just caught something the hospital staff missed," she said, once the charge nurse had left. "For your own father. I don't think I've ever actually watched you work before, not like this." "This is what I do every single shift," I told her, gently. "For strangers, not just for Dad. I've been doing this for a decade." She was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said. "I think I'm only now actually understanding what that means." My father was taken for his catheterization procedure a few hours later, a period of waiting that stretched long enough for the initial adrenaline of the crisis to fade into something more exhausted, more reflective. David, sitting beside me in the waiting room, broke the silence first. I don't think I ever fully understood what you do either, honestly, he said. I think I just absorbed how Mom and Dad talked about it, without ever really looking at it directly myself. Watching you tonight, translating everything, staying so calm through all of it, that's not nothing, Erin. That's actually incredibly hard, and you're clearly great at it. I told him I appreciated hearing that, though I admitted, honestly, that hearing it in the middle of a crisis felt strange, layered with complicated feelings I hadn't expected to have space for that night. I think that's fair, David said. I don't think tonight erases 10 years of comments. I think it just makes it a lot harder to keep pretending those comments were ever fair in the first place. My father's procedure revealed a significant blockage, successfully treated with a stent, and he was moved to a cardiac care unit for recovery and monitoring over the following days, a process I stayed closely involved with, both as his daughter and, increasingly, as the family member who could actually understand and translate what his medical team was telling us. I want to be honest that I found myself, during those days, doing exactly the work I'd spent a decade building expertise in, advocating clearly for a patient's needs, asking pointed questions of the care team, catching a medication timing issue on day 2 that the overnight team had nearly missed, explaining the specific rehabilitation protocol my father would need to follow once he was discharged. My mother watched this unfold over several days with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, not quite awe, but something adjacent to it, a specific, dawning recognition that the daughter she'd once described as avoiding a real career had, in fact, spent a decade building exactly the kind of expertise that was now, undeniably, saving both of them from confusion and fear during the most frightening week of their lives. On the 3rd day of my father's hospital stay, once he was stable enough that the immediate crisis had passed into something closer to ordinary recovery, my mother found me alone in the family lounge, getting coffee between visits. I need to say something, she said, and I don't want you to think this is just about being scared and grateful in the moment. I've been thinking about it since that first night. I told her I was listening. I said things to you, over the years, about your career, that I don't think I ever fully examined, she said. I called it a waste of money once, to your aunt, at your birthday. I remember saying it. I told myself, at the time, that it was just a joke, that you'd understand I didn't mean it literally. But watching you this week, doing exactly the work I dismissed, I don't think I can pretend anymore that it was just a joke. I think I genuinely believed nursing was somehow less than what I wanted for you, and I was wrong, completely wrong, in a way I'm ashamed of. I want to describe my response carefully, because I think the specific balance I tried to strike, honest about the hurt, without letting the moment become purely about vindication, mattered to how the rest of this played out. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. I do. But I need you to understand something. This isn't the first time I've been good at my job. I've been good at it for 10 years. I've saved lives in situations far more dramatic than Dad's, situations you never saw, because you never asked. The only difference this week is that you were finally in the room to see it happen to someone you love. My mother was quiet for a long moment. I know, she said. I think that's the part that's hardest to sit with. That it took this, specifically, for me to actually see something that was true the whole time. I don't need you to feel guilty forever, I said. I just need you to actually mean it, going forward. Not just this week, while everything's still raw and scary. 6 months from now, at a normal family dinner, when nothing dramatic is happening. That's when I'll know if anything's actually changed. Later that same conversation, my mother said something I hadn't expected, something that added a layer of context to her decade of dismissive comments that I found genuinely useful, even as it didn't excuse them. I gave up on a career of my own, you know, she said, when I had you and David. I don't think I ever fully told you that story properly. I wanted to go back to school for social work, before I got pregnant with you. I always told myself I'd go back eventually, and I never did. I think, somewhere underneath everything, I wanted you to have the kind of impressive, external career I never let myself have, and nursing didn't fit that picture I'd built in my head, even though it should have. I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, for the first time, that her dismissiveness hadn't been really about nursing itself, or even really about me, It had been about her own unresolved disappointment, projected onto a version of my career she'd never bothered to actually examine. "I think that explains a lot," I told her, "but I want to be clear, it doesn't excuse it. Your disappointment about your own life wasn't something I should have had to carry, dressed up as commentary about my career." "I know," she said. "I'm not offering it as an excuse. I just wanted you to understand where it actually came from, since I think I finally understand it myself, only now." My father, once he was well enough for a real conversation beyond the immediate logistics of his recovery, brought up the topic himself, unprompted, on the day before his discharge. "I've had a lot of time lying in this bed to think," he said. "About a lot of things. I think the comment about you still figuring things out, at your cousin's wedding, I think about that a lot now. I said that in front of extended family, about a daughter who was already 3 years into saving people's lives for a living. I remember that comment," I told him. "I've remembered it for 8 years, actually." He winced visibly at that. "I don't have a good excuse," he said. "I think I had a very narrow idea of what success looked like, built around my own career, and I applied that narrow idea to both my kids without ever really examining whether it made sense for either of you. David happened to fit into it more easily. You didn't, and I think I held that against you longer than I should have, even after there was plenty of evidence I was wrong." "What made you finally see it?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Watching you these past few days," he said. "Watching you talk to my doctors like you belonged in that conversation, because you did. Watching your mother's face when you explained something to her clearly for the first time all week. I think I finally understood, watching all of that, exactly how much expertise you'd built, completely outside of anything I ever bothered to notice." About a month after my father's discharge, once he'd recovered enough for ordinary family life to resume, we had our first regular family dinner since the hospital stay, a test, in its own quiet way, of whether the reckoning of that week would translate into any lasting change once the crisis itself had faded. I want to describe what was different, because I think the specifics matter more than a general assurance that things improved. My father, unprompted, asked me directly about a difficult case I'd mentioned briefly weeks earlier, remembering the detail and following up on it genuinely, rather than offering the polite, disinterested nod that had characterized a decade of similar moments. My mother, at one point, mentioned to my aunt, in my hearing, that I'd basically saved your father's life, translating everything the doctors said, catching things the hospital staff almost missed, a sentence that landed with a specific, complicated weight, given how differently she'd once described my career to that same aunt. David caught my eye across the table at one point, a small, knowing look passing between us, both of us registering the same quiet, significant shift without needing to say anything about it directly. I want to be honest that not everything shifted cleanly, because I think the more complicated, uneven version of this story is more true than a fully resolved one would be. My mother, several months later, at a different family gathering, made an offhand comment about a cousin's daughter who'd just been accepted to law school, a specific note of pride in her voice that I recognized, uncomfortably, as similar to the enthusiasm I'd always wished for regarding my own career. I don't think she meant anything pointed by it. I think it was simply an old habit of valuing certain kinds of achievement more instinctively than others, one that a single dramatic hospital stay hadn't fully undone. I mentioned this to her afterward, gently, not as an accusation, but as an honest observation. "I noticed how excited you got about law school," I said. "I don't think you meant anything by it, but I want you to notice it too, because I think old habits are exactly the thing that needs continued attention, not just the big, dramatic moments." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "You're right," she said. "I think I'll always have some instinct towards certain kinds of prestige. I'm going to keep working on noticing it, the way you just did for me, instead of assuming one hospital stay fixed something that took years to build." A few weeks after my father's discharge, I found myself, during a slow stretch of a shift, telling the whole story to a colleague, Priya, a fellow trauma nurse I'd worked alongside for years and considered one of my closer friends in the department. She listened carefully, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "I had almost the exact same thing happen with my dad, 3 years ago," she said. except mine never really got there. He still, to this day, introduces me as working at the hospital, like I'm answering phones somewhere, even after I stabilized him myself during a stroke in his own living room before the ambulance arrived. I asked her how she'd made peace with that, given how differently her story had resolved compared to mine. I stopped needing him to say it, she said. I think that's the actual lesson, honestly, more than whether your specific parents eventually come around. The work is real whether or not they ever fully see it. I got tired of waiting for validation that might never come, and I decided my own knowledge of what I do, and what it's worth, had to be enough on its own. Her story stayed with me, a reminder that the ending my family and I eventually reached wasn't guaranteed, wasn't something every nurse in a similar situation gets to have. I felt, hearing it, a specific gratitude for how things had unfolded with my own parents, layered against an awareness that the resolution itself had required a genuine crisis to force it into being, something Priya's family, for whatever reason, still hadn't experienced or hadn't responded to the same way mine eventually had. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say the hospital crisis fixed everything permanently, that my parents transformed instantly and completely into people who'd always respected my career. That's not quite accurate, and I think it's more honest to say so. What actually happened was something slower and more realistic. A crisis forced a truth into visibility that had been true the entire time, and my parents, to their credit, did the harder work of sitting with that truth rather than letting it fade back into old patterns once the immediate fear had passed. It wasn't instant. It required ongoing attention, gentle correction, the kind of ordinary vigilance that any real change actually requires. I used to think the hardest part of my career would be the clinical challenges, the difficult cases, the long shifts, the emotional weight of trauma nursing. I've since learned there's a different kind of hard, spending a decade excelling at meaningful, difficult work while the people who raised you quietly categorized it as somehow less than what they wanted for you, until circumstance finally forced them to see what had been true all along. I mentor several newer nurses now, part of my ongoing role in the emergency department, and I've started sharing a version of this story with the ones who mention, sometimes hesitantly, that their own families don't fully understand or respect the work they've chosen. You don't need a crisis to validate what you do, I tell them. I got mine, eventually, but I built a decade of genuine expertise before that crisis ever happened, and that expertise was real the entire time, regardless of whether my family understood it. Don't wait for someone else's emergency to know your own worth. I think about that advice often, turning it over for myself as much as for the nurses I'm offering it to. My father's cardiac event gave my parents a window into work I'd been doing skillfully for a decade. But the skill itself, the years of building genuine expertise in trauma care, existed long before that night, entirely independent of whether anyone in my family ever fully saw it. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I carry with me now every time I clock in for a shift, the same work I was doing for a decade before my family finally, fully understood what it meant. Expertise doesn't require an audience to be real. I was a good nurse for 10 years regardless of whether my parents ever said so out loud, regardless of the still figuring things out comments, regardless of the waste of money joke told at my own birthday party. My competence existed independent of their recognition of it, built patient by patient, shift by shift, long before a 2 a.m. phone call finally forced them to see what had been true the entire time. 6 months after my father's hospital stay, I found myself watching closely for the specific test I'd set for my mother that day in the family lounge, whether anything had actually changed once the crisis itself had fully faded into ordinary memory. The test came unexpectedly, at a cousin's engagement party, an entirely unrelated gathering with no medical urgency attached to it at all. Someone at the table asked, casually, what everyone did for work, and when it came around to me, my mother, sitting beside me, answered before I could. My daughter's a trauma nurse, she said, with a specific, genuine pride in her voice that I registered immediately as different from anything I'd heard from her before that hospital stay. She's been doing incredible work for a decade. She actually caught a medication error for her own father in the hospital that the overnight staff missed. I don't think people fully understand how much skill that job actually requires until they watch it up close. I sat there, listening to my mother describe my career with a specificity and genuine admiration I'd waited 15 years to hear, and felt something settle in me that I hadn't expected, not quite forgiveness, exactly, and not quite triumph either, but something closer to a quiet, hard-won relief that the change I'd asked for, all those months earlier in a hospital family lounge, had actually held. I think, if there's a single thing I'd want other nurses navigating similar family dynamics to take from this story, it's the specific, hard-won understanding that you don't need to wait for a crisis to validate your own worth, even if, like me, a crisis is ultimately what finally opens your family's eyes. I spent a decade building genuine, meaningful expertise, entirely independent of whether my parents ever fully saw it. That expertise was real the whole time, real for the 6-year-old girl I helped save years before my father's collapse, real for every patient I've cared for across a decade of shifts my family never asked about. Their eventual recognition, arriving finally at 2 a.m. in an emergency room, didn't create that reality. It only, finally, caught up to it. If you've ever had your work or your worth dismissed by people who later needed exactly what you'd built, I'd love to hear how you handled it. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.